Hello and welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the people, policy, and politics that drive Texas. I'm your host, Brian Phillips. I'm the Chief Communications Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And with me, as always, is my venerable co-host, Derek Cohen, our Chief of Research. All right, Derek, quick takes on the legislature right now. Still buzzing?
Well, there's no other way to put it than that. I mean, you just have to see, the fact that we're getting, Senate's voted many bills off the floor already. House are starting to get bills to the floor and Senate bills to committee. I mean, this is like I'll say this is the second starting gun, but if we break it down by that, we're already on like the fourth or fifth starting gun of, say, 10.
And this is the second half, right? Like we're officially halfway through session.
Yeah, we are, I believe, 67 days left at this recording on a Wednesday, if I recall correctly.
All right. So we got 2 quarters left. Let's get it all to see how much we can get done.
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, we always like to start with something fun right here at the top with our hot take. And, of course, the hottest take of anything going on right now is, of course, Texas Representative Jasmine Crockett is trying to desperately explain away her offensive and unfortunate comments about the governor. But we don't need to dive into that because what needs to be said about that has already been said. And the governor, of course, has been magnanimous about it. But that did bring up a question of political gaffes. And there have been a lot out through the years, and certainly as old as we are in our political histories, there's been a lot. And I'm just curious if you have a favorite. You have a favorite famous political gaffe that you want to share?
Oh, I'd have to go with, I'd say probably one of the most undisputable ones would be, I'm not a witch.
Oh,
that was definitely
what was her name? The Senate candidate from New Jersey,
Christine O'Donnell,
Delaware or something like that.
Yeah, if I recall correctly.
Yeah,
in which I don't remember if it was like something leading up to her candidacy. Or no, she was on Bill Maher or something.
Yeah.
And said she dabbled in witchcraft, or said tangentially that she did as a teenager or something. And then that kind of got built fire behind it. And then she was like, I need to get out in front of this witch thing. And I was like, and then you just see that like an ad, and I remember seeing it for the first time, like, I am not a witch. And it's like, that sounds like something a witch would say, It's like,
she doth protest too much.
Yeah. I was like, I didn't think you were a witch until now.
Yeah. Well, the problem with political gaffes is usually there's a old adage in political communication that your opponents will always tell you what they're afraid of, right? And so that's usually when that happens, is that whenever they're trying to address something that they're worried about, the public knowing or the public believing, false perceptions or something like that. But when they address those things, that's always when the gaffes usually happen, and that's a great example of something that they thought that they were.
Are you suggesting you should have steered into the skid and said, like, I put a hex on you?
I'm totally a witch. Well,
give me some Eye of Newt.
And that's why mine. I got a couple from way back in the day, but of course, this would have been Dukakis and the helmet episode and the tank, and of course, the perception of him coming, we're still very much in the Cold War, coming out of the Reagan years. He wanted to project strength in on national security issues, which he clearly did not. And so they put him in this tank and they put that silly helmet on him and he sticks his head out the top, and it was all over after that. But then 4 years later, same kind of thing with George H.W. Bush and not being relatable to the common man. We're at a time when the economy wasn't doing very well, and he goes to the grocery store to show that he's just like everybody else and can pick stuff off the shelf. And then they asked him how much milk cost, and I think he said like 75 cents or something. It was just completely and totally way off. So another good ones from back in the day in terms of political.
It was like asking Rain Man how much a candy bar was worth.
Yeah, exactly. Reed, I'll introduce our guest in a minute, but you go back a long time, not to date you at all, but you've been around politics a long time.
It is what it is.
You have a favorite Texas gaffe, or do you have a favorite national gaffe?
Yeah, the one that comes to mind to me from sort of my early political consciousness is Howard Dean and the Democratic primary, when he was kind of clear sailing, and
he
had that kind of outburst, and things pretty dramatically precipitously fell off for him after his outburst. I'm not even sure what he was doing or what he was saying. It was just an unfortunate combination of words and sounds, I think, and just like that, a campaign was over. So that's the one that always sticks out in my mind, just because probably the one I remember the most from, when I was starting to get into politics.
Jefferson, you can splice in the from here. All right. Well, my favorite part of the show is our shameless plug. If you're not subscribed to The Post, you should. It's a weekly newsletter that we put together. You can subscribe at texaspolicy.com/The Post. We have all kinds of exclusive information in there, kind of a digest of what's going on in Texas and what TPPF is working on, as well is always something a little fun at the end, something Texas related, usually complaining about the Cowboys or some other sports ball thing. So you can get that again at texaspolicy.com/the post. All right, let's get to our guest interview. You've already met Reed briefly. Reed Clay is the president of the Texas Nuclear Alliance. He's got a very long and illustrious career, but I'll just say here that he was the former chief operating officer of the state of Texas under Governor Abbott, extensive career in managing complex government operations, legislative processes, and strategic political implementation. Does that about cover
Man,
most
that sounds
of it?
great.
Excellent. All right.
It's like I wrote it myself.
President of the Texas Nuclear Alliance. I can kind of guess what that would be, but why don't you tell us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we're a trade association like, many of the others here in Austin, Texas Oil and Gas Association, Texas Association of Manufacturers, Texas Chemical Council. The only difference is we're brand new. We've been around for about 2.5 years and really was a brainchild of mine, having been exposed to some of the, what I'll call crazy politics around nuclear and really some of the tensions between the anti-nuke crowd and that same crowd's position on climate change and the inconsistencies between being anti-nuke and also wanting to be serious about climate change. And I looked around and no one was really advocating for nuclear. And I think that's in large part because the industry had really kind of atrophied over the previous couple decades. Frankly, the anti-nukes probably did a pretty good job. And so, my wife calls it my midlife crisis, but kind of got to be in my bonnet, started the Texas Nuclear Alliance, and we're focused on two things. One is advocating at the Texas Capitol up here for pro-nuclear policies, kind of like what NEI does at the national level, the Nuclear Energy Institute. And then the second is more focused on grassroots and grass tops so that when we go to deploy nuclear again in this state, we've got the support at the local level to make sure that we can follow through on the deployments.
Let's dig into a little bit. That's a little surprising to me that a place like Texas, which has, number one is the number one energy state in the country, and we pride ourselves on it, right? With all things, all of the above. I mean, we have more even wind and solar than anybody else. Much, not to mention oil and gas. You would think nuclear would want to be part of that. Plus, we have a ton of land, right? Like way out west, where you would be able to put nuclear reactors and such. Why do you think that like an organization like yours hadn't existed previous to a couple of years ago? And you mentioned that the industry had atrophied. What were the reasons for those?
Yeah, I mean, I think it didn't exist because the industry didn't exist. And, to put a finer point on your comments about Texas being a perfect place for it, we actually, it's everything you said is true. We have a lot of land, low regulatory environment, a need for power, lots of population growth, lots of business growth that's driving that need for power. But we also have two existing sites that were originally meant to have 4 reactors each. They both have 2 reactors each, and they're both supposed to be double the size. And because of politics, and this politics infected nuclear kind of nationwide, a lot of it attributable to Chernobyl and then Fukushima. Frankly, the industry, we just stopped building nuclear, and Texas isn't alone in that. The U.S. is that's a U.S.-wide problem. The only nuclear that's been built in the last few decades is the 2 that just went online in Georgia. Meanwhile, China is building 22 reactors today, and so I think it's in large part the politics and perception around nuclear that really soured in the 80s, and then just kind of continued through Fukushima. Led to a lack of interest and a lack of belief that we were going to build nuclear, and therefore, no real need for an industry association like ours. That's obviously changed in, recent years.
Well, let me ask, because before we get off this topic, I think this is a very interesting point, is about the politics of that. So if you look at the history of nuclear energy, nuclear incidents even, we've only really had 2 major irradiating, people-killing nuclear incidents. We had Windscale in 1957 in Umbria and in England, and then Chernobyl, and then obviously the problems that came with Fukushima were part of a natural disaster. 3 Mile Island didn't kill anybody. We basically have, outside of the only Western country that's ever had a nuclear disaster, then being England, we have a sterling record on this. What I don't understand is how, with all this time gone, what's the scary boogeyman now?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't think there is one. I think it's a perception problem, and I think it is pretty handy political work on the other side from the anti-nuclear crowd. One choke point that they've always grasped onto that they continue to work in this state is around nuclear waste. What are we going to do with the waste? The fact is that, our waste policy doesn't have a final answer to it yet. That's true. But we also haven't had incidents with our waste, and our waste is very tightly controlled. And what I mean by that is the regulations around how we store it are state of the art and without incident. And in addition to that, we know exactly where every piece of nuclear waste is in this country. It's tracked like no other industrial waste is. The third thing I would say about that, and not to get off on the waste tangent, but is the waste that exists in this country could fit in a Walmart that's 6 to 8 stories high. So there's just not very much of it. The second thing is I think the anti-nuclear crowd also really did a good job of latching on to 3 Mile Island. Like what you said about 3 Mile Island is true. There was nobody who was irradiated from that above sort of what's considered to be allowable or healthy levels. In fact, one chart I've seen shows that the max radiation dose that anybody received from 3 Mile Island is less than what you would get flying from New York to LA. So there's just a lot of misperceptions, and I think that's been driven by, the politics on the other side of this. And that's something that this organization, the Alliance, is really designed to do, is to lean into these incidents, frankly, to tell the truth about them. Because when you look at the safety record of nuclear, it really is a very good one. And we just happen to have a few examples of where things have gone wrong that have been A, misconstrued, and I think B, very visible in people's consciousness. And the only way around that is to lean into it and educate people about it.
We had at our Texas Policy Summit we did earlier this year. We had a panel on nuclear, and one of the sort of funny but very true stats that came up was that more people had died falling off roofs installing solar than had died being accidentally exposed to radiation.
They're probably actually getting more exposure to radiation from the sun than they are while installing them on the roof.
Right, and so
if you just sorry to interrupt, but if you look at different safety records of the different power sources we have. And I don't necessarily love the way they do these because they lump in death or injury attributed to pollution in addition to sort of what I would call sort of like industrial accident problems. Nuclear is at the bottom of that. Even accounting for those, pollution things. Simply put, like the record, as you said, Derek, is extremely positive and very good, and it's something that we really need to lean into and tell that story because we're going to have people telling the opposite story, and if we're not leaning into it and rebutting that with real facts, then we're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, as the comms guy, all I'm thinking is like, why isn't there more of a perception? Why isn't there more of a PR campaign that's out there? Because all of the data is really good. It's not like you're spinning the data, to make people believe something that's not true or to put a happy face on it. I mean, the data demonstrates over and over again how safe nuclear has been. So is it just because there hasn't been an industry or an organization like yours that's sort of like, as we say in political communication, you go dark, you let the other team essentially define you. And so nuclear has been dark for a decade in Texas. So
that's a tough, I mean, why there isn't and why there hasn't been more of a push than there has been lately. I would argue that particularly some of the work that NEI and others have done federally, lately has been really good and really positive. But prior to that, I think it just sort of was accepted that it had really got into the consciousness of, Americans that nuclear was bad. I think some of that is associated with those accidents that we talked about. I think some of it was a really good job by the anti-nuclear crowd of conflating nuclear power with nuclear weapons. And so there was a whole generation that I think
the word did it.
Yeah, the word just sort of was an obvious turnoff, and I think it just turned people off from thinking they'd be able to go and make a difference. If you look at public polling now, I know you guys have looked at it, things are very different. It's at the very least, and I think this may be an understatement, people are receptive to having a conversation about nuclear, which makes organizations like NEI and the Texas Nuclear Alliance, I think there's something to work with there and some headway to be made. Frankly, I think we've got a tailwind right now, and one of the things that I don't want to do is have the industry not capture that tailwind, build an infrastructure that's going to sustain it through, when the winds do change, because they will. When we start to deploy, you're actually already seeing it happen. We'll talk about it in a minute, I'm sure. But when the winds do change, when we start to build nuclear in this state again, it's not gonna be easy. I mean, there's gonna be opposition to it, and so we need to take the tailwinds we've got now, build an infrastructure to put in place so that when we start to build, we're going to be able to actually follow through on it.
Derek, you know how some people don't like oil and gas, and so they say thermal energy. Is there like a different word? Can we say atomic energy?
Technically, nuclear is thermal, as it heats up a source that drives the turbine.
Could say fission.
Fission.
I don't know if that's better.
Yeah,
It's kind of
poll test that or message test that.
But I think an important thing, and speaking of how it works, let's talk a little bit about the reactors, because I think part of the misconception, and this doesn't justify retroactively the misconception where it was taken up, but we generally see like the reactors we're talking today are nothing like the ones they had back in,
like the Simpsons reactors, like those things.
Yeah, I was about to say yes, where Homer could do the whole thing from home with his bird hitting the keyboard. So with the reactors today, how do those differ from the reactors of years past, and what does that look like in terms of a deployable infrastructure?
So there's two key differences, I think. One is technological, and I guess maybe the other is too, but I think it's more engineering. I think on the safety side, the cooling systems are more passive now. They used to require very active involvement from humans.
You got to pump stuff through or stick something in water.
Exactly. In order to make sure that the chain reaction that's actually causing the heat and the steam can be controlled. Now they have passive sort of control systems in place, and that's true for large scale and for small scale or small modular. I think the other thing is the difference, potentially between large scale reactors and small modular. Small modular reactors are, if you're talking, there's several, three categories. Large scale, which is, we'll talk at gig level. Small is, let's call it 80 to 300 megawatts. And then micro reactors, there's everything from like 1 to 20 megawatts. So those are kind of the three categories. And when you start talking about micro and small modular reactors, the safety footprint for those is just much smaller than a gig scale reactor. And so that's the other thing that's happening right now in the space, where people are realizing we can build these things in a safety envelope that is much smaller, which makes them, to your point, easier to sort of deploy them more widely and distributed. So I think those kind of the two things. And that second piece is maybe more engineering than it is technology, because a lot of the technology is actually very similar to stuff that's been around for a long time. And then the first piece is kind of technology advances around the cooling systems.
How game changing are the SMRs, or is it versus all the investment and everything that is needed to do the large scale reactors? Do SMR kind of change the economics and the politics of getting nuclear reactors online?
For sure, I think potentially they do. I mean, I think when you look at large scale and you look at small modular, what you're really looking at is two different ways of trying to achieve scale. Large scale, the way we've traditionally done nuclear is we're going to build a lot of nuclear all at once. The problem with that is it's very capital intensive like upfront. And so the payback period is much longer. And when you have just economically speaking, when you have other options that are much cheaper to build, like natural gas, wind, and solar.
At scale,
the latter two that have been heavily subsidized, which makes it even more economical to build those. You just have a financial economic problem in terms of building large scale. I think there are things that are happening from a regulatory perspective that are trying to drive down the timeline and therefore the cost of building large scale. And I think a lot of that is very promising. One of the things that we won't see scale at that level until we build more than just two of these. We're going to have to build 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in order to really drive down the cost of those, because we've got to build a workforce. Georgia had workforce issues. You got to work out the design kinks. Those are being worked out. The second way of driving scale is really through manufacturing processes. And that's what small modular and micro reactors are doing. They're trying to bring manufacturing process to the nuclear world the way that, natural gas turbines, any other energy sources, built these things on a sort of at a factory and then shipped them out to be put together. That's what small modular is designed to do, and micro. The idea is that will also speed up the regulatory process in the sense that, you'll have a design that has been seen and approved, and that will make it easier to sort of repeat the regulatory process rather than, these projects, the way we've traditionally viewed them is each project is a new regulatory process, even if some of the technology is the same.
Yeah, there wasn't the issue a long time ago. I did some work in New Mexico, which has a really good nuclear industry. But one of the issues was, they'd get these initial permits to start building or whatever, or they would initially get the permits for the designs, and then they would get ready to build. But the actual permitting of like putting a shovel in the ground took 10 years,
right?
And those initial licenses were only good for 10 years, and so you would essentially lose out on the initial steps that you had taken. You'd have to restart it all over again. So the regulatory process is also a big roadblock.
Absolutely. I think, and I know TPPF is very, into government efficiency. And I think one place where we have been very inefficient as a government at the federal level is NRC. I mean, what I like to say is that bureaucracies are precautionary by nature. But the other problem with the NRC is that their mission is actually a precautionary mission. Their sole mission is safety. And we're not against safety, but it has to be balanced with actually deploying nuclear. And they have been focused on safety to the exclusion of the deployment of nuclear, frankly, over the last, decade or so. And I think even before, this day and age of DOGE, you were starting to see Congress and even administrations on both sides of the aisle take a look at the NRC to see how they can change the mandate about how they're licensing large and small modular reactors. And I think you're going to continue to see that with the Trump administration. And that's going to be very good for large scale nuclear. I think you could see that licensing period really compress, which brings down the cost significantly. Another perverse thing that goes on with the NRC is that when you actually pay them by the hour to review your permit and license.
Wow. So they have an incentive for
you talk about the incentive
10
system
years.
being backwards, and it's not a cheap hourly rate. I mean, this is expensive stuff, and so the incentive system is just backwards there. The mission is not balanced, and I think you've seen Congress, and I think you will see this administration really continue to put pressure on that.
And I want to ask you about that specifically because we've touched on it a little bit with the answer to Brian's last question there. I want to ask, so let's just hypothetically, Jefferson's not making the most of the studio. We're a nonprofit. We want to turn another dollar or two.
Hey, right there, easy.
Yeah, I want to put a nuclear reactor.
We pick on him because he doesn't have a mic.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect.
He can never defend himself except yelling from behind the camera about how well the Chiefs got robbed in the Super Bowl and that stuff. So, we want to build a nuclear reactor here, and then obviously, just pretend you don't need to worry about here, but let's just say we want to build a traditional nuclear reactor. Walk us through the actual process and identify where the pinch points are at the state and federal level, why these basically have gone so far out of favor just from a regulatory standpoint alone.
Yeah, I mean, there's significant upfront costs to get to the point of a docketed application with NRC. There's site preparation, engineering, technology work that's got to get done. That is not cheap. It's expensive. Frankly, that can be the riskiest capital of the whole thing, and there's a disincentive to invest in that part. But I mean, the real roadblock and the real length of time is from application to construction. And we talked about the disincentives, sort of having to pay for review. I think that's a big problem. Frankly, I think, not to repeat myself, but I think the mission of the NRC has been wrong. I mean, it used to be that the Atomic Agency had a dual mission of promoting nuclear and safety. That was done away with. DOE got, to the extent that anybody got the promotional side of nuclear. And NRC, which is the only real entity that matters in terms of regulatory approval in this whole process, got just the safety mandate. And that process is taking years. And it's unfortunately even an iterative process. I think, Brian, you were pointing this out a minute ago. And that uncertainty is enough to, the length of time obviously increases the cost significantly. And the uncertainty around how that outcome is going to be is a huge factor in investor, whatever capital, whether it's risk capital or whether it's debt financing. They're going to look at that process and say, A, it's expensive even if we make it all the way through, and B, are we going to make it all the way through? And so I think a lot of the focus needs to be there. I'll be honest. I think one of the reasons why I think Texas is going to be, nod to my former boss, the governor. I think he wants to make Texas the nuclear capital of the world. You mentioned that we're number one in wind, solar, oil and gas. We're number one in everything. And I think he wants to be number one in nuclear. One of the reasons, not the only reason, that I think we will be is our regulatory environment is going to be very conducive to this. I think there is an option on the table at some point. Congress probably has to act in order to do this, where some of this permitting and licensing gets devolved down to the states. They've done this with waste, so states, compact agreement states can handle low-level waste without too much interference from the federal government. That's worked pretty well. We've got a great facility in West Texas that handles low-level radioactive waste. That's, the high-level waste spent nuclear fuel problem is still unsolved, but we've got that solution out there. One of the things that I think has been bandied about, and I think, potentially Congress will look at, is can we give site permitting to the states so that if we approve a reactor design, particularly a small modular reactor that then is getting built in a manufacturing facility, can we give the state the authority to do the site permitting, which we're very capable of doing. I mean, we do it for any type of facility, natural gas, whatever. And I think if we were to get to that point, Texas is going to be, well positioned to be very efficient at it. And that's going to be one reason why I think we see a lot of deployment in the state of Texas when we get to that point.
When I was in New Mexico working on nuclear stuff, one of the coolest videos I ever saw was they were trying to prove the safety of the canisters. Because a big issue was like transporting the waste from one place to the other, not just where you put it, but like getting it from one place to the other. And it was like these massive canisters that they were proving, could hold the waste and have and still be safe. They took like a rig, like a Peterbilt, and at like 80 miles an hour, they put this thing on the back of it on a trailer, and at 80 miles an hour, they slammed it into a concrete wall, just destroyed the Peterbilt or whatever. And that canister went rolling, and of course, was totally unscathed. But it was just cool.
I think there's a video of it. If I remember correctly.
I've seen it. I mean, it's probably 10 years old now, but yeah, it was hilarious watching this massive 18-wheeler just get smashed into a concrete wall at 80 miles an hour.
We like those sorts of things.
It's pretty awesome. Yeah, absolutely. So then let's say you can actually get your thing built, right? Let's say you get your reactor finally built. One of the other issues is, of course, our market here in Texas, and one of the big issues is, well, we have a lot of wind and solar, and it's heavily subsidized. And so when wind and solar is working and the price is low, that's what's on the grid, and that's what's those are the electrons that people are using. But then when wind and solar is not working because it's intermittent and it's nighttime or the sun or the wind's not blowing, then the prices spike. And nuclear, and that's when nuclear and oil and gas are supposed to pitch in and be ready for everybody. But then the price spikes. And so one of the issues that we're seeing, particularly with getting these things off the ground and getting constructed, is fixing it so that it's even possible, economically viable, to make a profit as a nuclear generator. Because if you can't put your electrons on the grid because wind and solar are so heavily subsidized and dropping the price, but then when they need you, the price spikes, and you're having to pay a lot to get it on the grid. Where's the economic viability? So are there fixes, and are you thinking ahead in terms of not just the construction and development of that and where to put it and what to do with the waste, but actually being a viable business model in Texas?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is absolutely we've got to do something in the marketplace. I mean, my general sort of baseline belief is that ERCOT's deregulated environment is on par going to be a good thing for nuclear. The problem, as you guys know, is because we're deregulated, because it's an energy-only market, subsidies at the federal level can really have an outsized impact in this marketplace as compared to others that are more regulated. And that's what's happened. I mean, you guys know this. I mean, we've seen massive proliferation of intermittent resources like wind in particular, where we've gone from basically zero to, I think, 35-40% of our grid, at least installed capacity, in the last, call it 10 to 15 years.
Right.
And it's not because our marketplace is broken. It's because of federal subsidies that have an outsized impact in our marketplace. So one thing that I think really needs to be looked at is how do we price in reliability, and how do we make sure that a reliable electron is being paid the value that it deserves as compared to a less reliable one. People love to talk about how wind and solar are less expensive to build. They rarely take into account that you have to overbuild them and a lot of the other sort of ancillary costs that go along with those. So on the one hand, I think we need to the first thing we ought to do is re-level the playing field inside of ERCOT. And then long term, I really do think the market needs to look at how do we reward reliable electrons that we know are going to be there when we need them, And there's only a couple sources that are viable that do that. Nuclear is at the top of that list. I mean, when you look at capacity factors, nothing is more reliable than nuclear. It runs at 95% or so. I mean, I think Plant Vogtle 3 and 4 are upwards to, close to 98, 99% capacity factor. You look at wind, so like 30%, 35%. Those two things are not the same to consumers, and they shouldn't be treated the same to consumers. So I do think long term, I don't know, I think it would help in the short term, but I definitely think long term that nuclear will benefit and probably should see some sort of leveling of the marketplace here. The second thing I would mention, though, is that I think nuclear's got a future even outside, I don't want to say outside the marketplace, but maybe in spite of some of those irregularities or imbalances inside of ERCOT. And that's because of, we talked about the promise of small modular and micro-reactors. One of the promises there is that you will see a much more distributed grid with a lot more behind the meter power generation with purchase power agreements or power purchase agreements. I always get the P's mixed up. But and I think you're seeing that play out right now with large loads like the hyperscalers, for instance. But I think you're even potentially seeing, I mean, there's a project ongoing in Texas right now with Dow Chemical. They're replacing some behind the meter cogeneration assets, but potentially with nuclear. It's a partnership they announced with X Energy a couple years ago. And then Natura Resources, who's based in Abilene Christian, they've got a partnership with the Produced Water Consortium to maybe use their small reactors, molten salt reactor, to actually desal produced water. So you're seeing there's some of these behind the meter uses that I think can also be sort of provide the economic counterpoint or return on investment that developers are going to need to see. But if you're talking about utility scale, large scale reactors, yeah, I mean, the marketplace needs to value a reliable electron different than an intermittent electron.
And I want to hit on that micro-reactors, because I think that's a fascinating thing, and I think a lot of our listeners, and we've had many folks on here to talk about nuclear tangentially, never this much of a broadside. But let me ask you, with these micro-reactors, you said what is the output range on those?
I mean, these are my numbers, 1 to 20 megawatts.
And so what does 1 to 20 megawatts get you?
Potentially a lot, right? I mean, you get a small neighborhood, small development. I think the way that
a factory, perhaps.
Yeah, factory. I think you're seeing potentially production in the Permian. I mean, here's one of the cool things going on with nuclear right now. The oil and gas and nuclear were 50 years ago quasi foes, and right now there's a symbiotic thing going on with natural gas and nuclear. I'll just say oil and gas and nuclear. And it's at several levels. And I think one of it is the way that micro-reactors can potentially solve the electrification problem in oil fields like the Permian.
Can you explore that a little?
Sure. So right now, a lot of the multinationals are operating in a, global trade environment, right, where people are wanting quote unquote cleaner oil and gas. And what they mean by that is, mostly carbon free or reduced carbon, low carbon. And right now, a lot of the operations in the Permian are being operated by diesel generators. And so when you start to think about the electrification of the Permian and how to do that in a way that, helps them comply with some of their desire to be low carbon, nuclear is a great option for that. The ability to take a small reactor and essentially put it on a trailer and move it from production site to production site is a pretty powerful tool, not just from a low carbon perspective, but actually from a transmission perspective. Because when you talk about some of the transmission issues that the state's having, when you want to build a lot of generation, you got to build the infrastructure to get it there. That's very expensive. It's very expensive in the Permian where the population density is, much lower. And so the ability to have a microgrid or micro-reactor that kind of moves from point A to point B to power some of those operations offers multiple benefits that, I think the Permian in particular is very well suited to take advantage of.
Well, you must have sensed my next question, because that's what I was going to ask about. Our polling that we have internally here shows kind of a love-hate relationship with nuclear. 55%, which is good, I think, to this point. A majority of Texans support the use of nuclear energy for all the reasons that you have talked about today. And yet a majority, 52%, say that they would oppose the construction of a nuclear power plant in their county. And that obviously goes to safety issues, which we've already discussed. Don't need to hit on that again. But it does bring up this issue of transmission. So if they want to use the nuclear power and they want to use it because it's clean and because it's abundant and it runs at 99%, but they don't want it in their backyard, well, then you got to get it there. And so transmission issues, is that a big roadblock?
I think it is, but can I ask you a question? When
Sure.
you polled that, did you also ask them if they wanted to be a natural gas generation or a wind farm or a solar farm? Because I mean,
That's a good.
here's my point.
Yeah, sure. And no, we didn't, but I will on the next one.
I don't think anybody wants to be near a power plant. I mean, I think that's you're going to have a tough time convincing people that if they had a choice between having a home right next to a power plant, whatever type.
Well, people complain about the flicker, right, of the windmills and stuff. It literally drives you crazy.
I wouldn't want those near my house. I wouldn't want a solar field near my house. I wouldn't want a natural gas near my house. I mean, people don't want to. If they have a choice, they don't want to live next to something.
I'd have like a cool pump jack or something in my backyard. I could do that. Like,
you're missing a couple steps.
But I don't know where to take that one. But so my point is, I'm not sure that question is. I'm not sure the response to that question is really reflective of an opinion about nuclear.
Fair, yeah.
But set that aside. To get to your point about micro-reactors, I do think micro-reactors and small modular reactors potentially solve this problem because their footprint is so much smaller, and therefore their impact is more limited in terms of the surrounding environment. And not just from a safety perspective, although that's a big part of it and something that definitely is, going to be a concern to people that of any power plant, but even from a visual perspective, the way that a micro-reactor looks is much different than having a huge cooling, stack, out your back door or off your back porch. So I don't think there's any question that the ability to build a distributed grid using small modular or micro-reactors potentially solves that issue for nuclear, but frankly, any sort of power plant.
I don't know. Those I thought the old school reactors look really cool. If you fly to Jacksonville and you go from the airport to downtown, you ride right next to one. There's like one within, you can see it, it's not far off in the distance or anything. I always thought that was the coolest thing.
Well, I'm not going to lie. I've got a buddy who works at one of the big plants in Texas and routinely sends me sunrise pictures with the cooling stacks in front of it, and they're beautiful photos. So, but I've been red pilled, so they say. So,
all right. Well, last question. This is the right idea. We talk about policy solutions here. We've talked about a lot of the problems. What are you following in the legislature? Are there any specific bills you want to mention that address any of these issues? Yeah.
So we talked about the upfront capital costs of nuclear, and one of the things that we've been working on with Chairman Cody Harris, Chairman Darby, Senator Parker, Senator Schwartner, and the governor's office is HB 14, House Bill 14. It's the Advanced Nuclear Deployment Act, and it's basically designed to incentivize the early first, second, third of a kind deployment of nuclear to restart the engine, so to speak, on nuclear. Has multiple potential benefits. First is obviously grid related. We need reliable baseload power on our grid. Nuclear is one of really two options that we've got available to us right now. We haven't really had an all of the above strategy. We've had an all of the above except for nuclear strategy, and we need to add nuclear to that strategy. Economic development is another one. We talked about the atrophy of the industry. If nuclear does have a renaissance, which I think is almost unavoidable at this point, given the desire for low carbon and 24/7 power, the industry is going to have a massive regrowth. Texas is going to be well situated to get the lion's share of that because for reasons that we all know, low tax, low regulatory environment. So the idea here is to incentivize some of the early deployment here in the state of Texas so that we also capture that economic development, the manufacturing we talked about earlier, the fuel cycle that, is going to have to be rebuilt to, provide the fuel for these reactors. And frankly, the sort of ancillary manufacturing of the parts that needs to happen in order to build the reactors. The third is frankly energy security. I mean, because Texas is a leader in oil and gas, we have also been sort of at the center of creating energy security for the country and for our allies in the developing world. And right now, Russia and China are kicking our butts on nuclear, and Russia is they supply over 50% of enriched uranium to the world. They're the leading deployer or exporter of new nuclear to the developing world. China is building 22 reactors right now. We're building 0. If we want to continue, if the U.S. wants to continue and Texas wants to continue to be the sort of foundation of energy security for our allies and for the developing world, then we've got to lead on nuclear. And I think this is a big reason why you heard the governor in his State of the State talk about Texas leading nuclear renaissance.
Man, 22 reactors, and we're building 0.
0.
And doesn't
And they've
France,
got more planned.
And France uses a ton of nuclear, right? Like we can't be last.
70 to 80% of their grid is nuclear, and the one country that didn't feel the fuel price shocks that were caused by the initial outburst of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because they weren't relying on Russian gas, was France.
We can't have France beating us in anything, Darren.
Your lips to God's ears.
All right, that's the end of our guest interview. Reed, we do something fun at the end of the show. We call our 10-minute drill. If you'll stick around with us,
sure.
And I try to make it at least relevant to some things that you might know some things about. But otherwise, thank you for being with us. Thank you for answering our questions. Reed Clay, president of the Texas Nuclear Alliance, and is it TexasNuclearAlliance.com is your webpage?
TexasNuclearAlliance.org.
Yep. Okay, excellent, fantastic. All right, well, thank you for being on the show, and we'll jump into our 10-minute drill here for the last end of the show. Survey says we like to talk about what polling is going on. It just so happens that I have some energy polling. This is national energy polling. 57%, and these are all good stuff, 57% say that making American energy independent is more important than fighting climate change, to just 39% who take the opposite view that fighting climate change is more important than making America energy independent. Derek, does that surprise you at all?
No, because making America energy independent is a real thing, and that's not climate change denial or anything like that.
Sounds like it.
Now, but how many times have we actually talked in great detail about the anthropogenic nature of climate change? I'm not saying the climate's not changing, but to the extent that it's done so by man, and more so to the extent that it's modulatable by man, I think is questions that are yet unexplored. And I think that when people talk about energy independence, that's real, that's proximate. You can touch that. And by touch, maybe not touch electricity. We'd probably recommend against that. But at least when you flip the switch, a light comes on.
Yeah, right.
Right? And whereas how much we can do by self-impoverishment is probably not going to have all that much of a change on the climate.
Reed, the second data point is, and this is probably the most important, 59% say that reducing the cost and improving the reliability of electricity and gas is more important than fighting climate change. You mentioned a couple times about the hypocrisy of the left and sort of the fighting climate change, but then being anti-nuclear. Number one, does any of these numbers surprise you? Is that low, 57%, 59%? And then what do you mean by the hypocrisy of the anti-nuke left?
Yeah. So I'll go back to the first stats. I mean, I think part of the reason you're seeing that dichotomy between energy security versus climate change is that this country's been working on climate change, and we've seen a reduction in climate emissions. The problem isn't in the U.S. It's in China. And, despite all our good work, global emissions aren't going down because China's skyrocketing.
They're building a bunch of coal plants too, right along with the nuclear. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's one thing that, one reason why you see that discrepancy. What I mean by the hypocrisy is, and there's a story out yesterday about environmental groups who sent a letter to Governor Polis, I think his name is, in Colorado, who there's a bill on his desk that would classify nuclear as quote unquote clean energy. And these environmental groups who, have been telling us all what a nightmare climate change has been and how, we needed to build nothing but no emission wind and solar for the last 20 years, have asked him to veto the bill that would make nuclear clean energy. And that's because the hypocrisy I see is they're not serious about climate change, because if they were, nuclear is the obvious answer to that. It's utility scale, it's big, it's reliable. You can fight climate change, and it's proven. It was proven long before wind and solar were. So that's the hypocrisy I'm talking about. You're seeing it in this state. I mean, not to go back to HB 14, but if you look at the some of the testimony against that bill, it was from the same crowd saying the same things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're more anti-human than they are pro-planet or whatever. Because that's exactly right. Is that we know the number one thing for human development that we need is energy. And you see that across the world.
Don't say they're anti-human. They're pro-Malthusian.
Yeah, they're misanthropes is what they are. All right, so that's our Survey Says segment. We'll jump into our second segment, Lies, Damn Lies, and Statistics. This is a update of a new research paper that we have at Texas Public Policy Foundation. Probably our number 3 priority is eliminating taxpayer-funded lobbying. We have new updated numbers. 2 years ago, Texas local governments spent $75 million, as much as $75 million lobbying the state government, using your tax dollars to lobby the state government instead of picking up the phone and calling their state rep themselves. They spent $75 million. That number is now almost $100 million, as much as $100 million, $98.6 million to hire contract lobbyists because your mayor and your school board member can't pick up the phone and call the state senator and talk to them about what their issues are. We got to get rid of this, Derek.
Yeah, I think so. Well, obviously, I think so. Kind of signed off on the paper. But that being said, obviously we've talked about this before. We had James in here. We've talked about it as well. And the issue that taxpayer-funded lobbying specifically poses is not that if it does not exist, it keeps local sentiment from reaching the ear of the legislator or the lawmaker over it, right? Not at all. What this does is it basically creates layers of bureaucracy or layers in between the individual and and who represents them. Now, we talked about government qua government, in terms of can the mayor of a town get a representative on the phone? And this is something that we're going to have to do every time we have an elected lawmaker here. And, we asked Ms. Leah Wilson this, that any time that you have one of these groups, one of these localities call you up, do you walk out on whoever you're talking to and take that call? Or is it something that I'll get around to, the mayor of the third largest city in my district when I get around to it?
Yeah.
That's not how this works. And even so, in those cities can still have in-house people.
Right.
And so this is what I never understood this. All this says is the Austin white-shoed lobby firm folks, are unable to be paid by taxpayer dollars. Now, taxpayer dollars can still be spent on talking to the legislature professionally with a designated person, if that's what they wish to do.
But then that would open up all kinds of transparency and accountability measures in terms of how much that person's being paid, what they're spending their money on, what they're spending their time on, and that's why they don't want to do it. They want to hide behind the private lobbyists and
exactly. And that's the hypocrisy of this particular issue.
I probably should have asked if you were a taxpayer-funded lobbyist. I hope not.
I was just checking to make sure my shoes weren't white. They're brown. So.
But you do work for you're president of association.
These brown shoe lobbyists.
It's fair to say that you lobby the legislature. So hopefully I haven't offended you at all with any of that.
I've got thick skin.
Very good, very good. All right, so in our final segment of the show is, of course, what to watch for. We'd love to get your comments on what you're looking at. Me personally, we just got an announcement, I think today or yesterday, from the Speaker of the House that the Public Education Committee will consider for a vote HB 3. The school choice ESA bill, Derek, we have officially fulfilled our contractual obligation to talk about school choice.
You're leaving it late. You left it late.
I know. We're way into usually it's every 10 minutes or so. But no, next week there will be a vote in the Public Education Committee. For all expectations are that it will pass, and then it moves on to scheduling it to the floor debate, which is where all of the official mud and everything will be thrown. So looking forward to that debate as well, but looking forward to the vote and to see what other kind of discussion is around that. But everyone thinks it's going to pass, and then it'll move to the floor.
Yeah, and because I think that's a very important thing to watch for. What I'm going to be watching for is tomorrow I'm going to be testifying in State Affairs as a resource witness on the Judicial Conduct Commission. And so what I'll be watching for is when
humble brag.
It's not a humble brag. I was talking to Jonathan Sago, who's following a lot of the pro-life bills that are also in State Affairs, and they have several pro-life election bills. A lot of controversial bills in State Affairs tomorrow. So what I'm watching for is if this bill goes first. So I don't have to stick around until 8 p.m.
And Reed, you don't have to pick one that's related to energy. I know you can, or pick something. You could be looking forward to opening day of baseball, or
my Rangers. I hope they're going to be good again this year.
There you go, the Rangers.
No, I think everybody's watching HB 2 and 3 and SB 2. Obviously, on the House side, seems like a lot is waiting on that. And so I think anybody who's got an interest in,
and you've got 3 kids under 10, so that would be, you'd be just like the rest of us.
I'll give a choice.
Well, that's excellent. Well, thank you, Reed, so much again. Reed, the president of the Texas Nuclear Alliance. So go check out their activities and what they're up to. Do you have a newsletter or anything you want to plug?
Yeah, you can sign up for the newsletter, and then I would also watch nucleartexas.com. That's our summit site. Excellent. And we'll have a summit, our second annual summit. In November.
Yeah, you had a lot of notables at the inaugural summit.
Good event.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, well, thank you, Reed, for being here, and thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. As we always like to say at the end of every show, in the immortal words of Sam Houston, do good and risk the consequences. We'll see you next time.